Unplugged In, world leaders from 193 nations in New York for the United Nations General Assembly. At the top of the docket, climate change. But tensions in the Middle East are taking center stage. The United States says Iran is responsible for an attack on oil facilities in Saudi Arabia. Iran denies it and has threatened an all-out war if the U.S. retaliates. And climate change. Can and will world leaders come to a consensus on global warming? Unplugged In at UNGA 2019. Hello and welcome to Plugged In. I'm Greta Van Susteren. At the United Nations General Assembly, President Donald Trump said, since being elected, he has spent more than $2.5 trillion on the military. He's also said the United States is the world's most powerful nation in the world. And while the U.S. does not seek conflict with any country, he will defend U.S. interests around the world. Specifically, President Trump called out Iran as one of the greatest threats facing peace-loving nations. And although this year's focus at the UN General Assembly is climate change, President Trump never mentioned climate change. Instead, he used the UN podium to tout nationalistic policies, and he took direct aim at the concept of globalism.
Americans know that in a world where others seek conquest and domination, our nation must be strong in wealth, in might, and in spirit. That is why the United States vigorously defends the traditions and customs that have made us who we are. Like my beloved country, each nation represented in this hall has a cherished history, culture, and heritage that is worth defending and celebrating, and which gives us our singular potential and strength. The free world must embrace its national foundations. It must not attempt to erase them or replace them. Looking around and all over this large, magnificent planet, the truth is plain to see. If you want freedom, take pride in your country. If you want democracy, hold on to your sovereignty. And if you want peace, love your nation. Wise leaders always put the good of their own people and their own country first. The future does not belong to globalists. The future belongs to patriots. The future belongs to sovereign and independent nations who protect their citizens, respect their neighbors, and honor the differences that make each country special and unique. At the center of our vision for national renewal is an ambitious campaign to reform international trade. For decades, the international trading system has been easily exploited by nations acting in very bad faith. As jobs were outsourced, a small handful grew wealthy at the expense of the middle class. In America, the result was 4.2 million lost manufacturing jobs and $15 trillion in trade deficits over the last quarter century. The United States is now taking that decisive action to end this grave economic injustice. Our goal is simple. We want balanced trade that is both fair and reciprocal. The most important difference in America's new approach on trade concerns our relationship with China. In 2001, China was admitted to the World Trade Organization. Our leaders then argued that this decision would compel China to liberalize its economy and strengthen protections to provide things that were unacceptable to us, and for private property, and for the rule of law. 2 decades later, this theory has been tested and proven completely wrong. Not only has China declined to adopt promised reforms, it has embraced an economic model dependent on massive market barriers, heavy state subsidies, currency manipulation, product dumping, forced technology transfers, and the theft of intellectual property, and also trade secrets on a grand scale. The United States lost 60,000 factories after China entered the WTO. This is happening to other countries all over the globe. The World Trade Organization needs drastic change. The second largest economy in the world should not be permitted to declare itself a developing country in order to game the system at others' expense. For years, these abuses were tolerated, ignored, or even encouraged. Globalism exerted a religious pull over past leaders, causing them to ignore their own national interests. But as far as America is concerned, those days are over. To confront these unfair practices, I placed massive tariffs on more than $500 billion worth of Chinese-made goods. Already, as a result of these tariffs, supply chains are relocating back to America and to other nations, and billions of dollars are being paid to our Treasury.
The rejection of globalism by President Donald Trump is a stance he's not deviated from since he became President of the United States. Joining us to discuss the Trump administration's message to the world is VOA White House correspondent Steve Herman. Steve, we saw the public discussion, the speeches from the podium, but behind the scenes, a lot's going on. And one of the things is President Trump met with the Prime Minister Boris Johnson of the UK. What can you tell me about that meeting?
Well, I was in the room for that, Greta, and I asked a question to President Trump what he thought when he heard the news that the Supreme Court in Britain had essentially declared that Boris Johnson had committed an unlawful act by proroguing the Parliament. And the president replied, well, that's just another day at the office for Boris. And the prime minister quickly chimed in that the next day would not be just another day at the office for him, that he would be really under an inquisition by Parliament reconvening because of what he did. And of course, that really casts in doubt what those two leaders had been intending to do after the exit of the United Kingdom from the European Union, which was to quickly conclude a one-on-one trade deal, the type of deals that President Trump likes so much, these bilateral, not these multilateral deals. And at this point, there's some doubt whether Boris Johnson would still be in office by the time of the exit of the UK from the EU.
Well, if the reports are correct, President Macron of France met with President Rouhani, Iran, on Monday. Then on Tuesday, President Macron met with President Trump, and then later met again with President Rouhani. Is he the go-between to try to resolve some of the differences between Iran and the United States?
There appear to be a number of go-betweens, and President Trump acknowledged as much on Tuesday when we asked him about that, him confirming that not only the French, but the Pakistanis and the Germans and possibly others also involved, but the president saying we don't need a mediator. The Iranians know how to get a hold of us, and there's some speculation as to what may have been going on behind the scenes this week here in New York at the United Nations, whether there have been some high-level contacts between the Americans and the Iranians. But the White House keeping very mum, not even wanting to confirm to us that Macron and Merkel both met separately with President Trump to discuss Iran.
Steve, you also cover, well, you do cover the White House, and you're up in New York here covering the UNGA because the president is here. But during the course of the day and after President Trump spoke, it began to be news that the Democratic Party, opposition party to President Trump, might make an announcement that they would seek a formal impeachment of President Trump. That happened later in the day at 5 o'clock. But how much did that consume the White House aides and the discussion, if at all, yesterday?
It took over the day. What happened was we were at a hotel with the president, and we were supposed to go in one meeting, multilateral meeting about the Middle East. And then right outside the door, we were told we're not going into that meeting. We were loaded back in the vans, and the motorcade whizzed back for the 2 or 3 minute ride to Trump Tower. And President Trump went up to his residence in Trump Tower, turned on the TV, and watched that announcement by Speaker Pelosi, and then immediately, of course, started tweeting about it. And we can definitely say that Tuesday was a watershed day for this presidency, whether it's a formal impeachment a process, but just the word impeachment in this what is being called an inquiry crosses the Rubicon now for this presidency.
Steve, the tape we just played of the president in his speech at the UN, it was trade, 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 and it was a message in particular to China. Do you have any way to, to measure whether or not it has an impact on China whatsoever? Because we do have these tariffs here in the United States on so many goods.
No, not really. The Chinese have heard for weeks, months, where the president is at on this. There are talks that have been going on and off and on again. The president really does need a deal before the election next year. The speculation is that although President Xi in Beijing is under some pressure as well, he can wait it out much longer. He's effectively president for life. So he's not facing re-election next year. President Trump is. There appears that there could be more short midterm damage to the U.S. economy, especially to American farmers, than repercussions that would happen for Chinese consumers and producers.
President Trump talked about globalism. Do you have any sort of way to measure how much that resonated, and was that a departure from any of his earlier messages?
Not at all, Greta. We've heard this message from day one, from when he was on the campaign running for president 2016, as a matter of fact. That message plays very well for his domestic constituency, for him to come here to the United Nations and essentially spit in the face of what the UN stands for. That plays very well with those who support President Trump, who not only are suspicious about the UN, but have quite a disdain for the world body. And there are all sorts of conspiracy theories that have persisted for many years in the American heartland about the UN. So for Trump to do this, it's playing very well to his base.
Steve, thank you. VOA White House correspondent Steve Herman, who is traveling with the president. U.S. domestic issues were not the only topics on President Trump's agenda. He left the door open to embrace friendship. But Mr. Trump took aim at Iran, saying the world has a duty to act on what he called Iran's menacing behavior.
The United States does not seek conflict with any other nation. We desire peace, cooperation, and mutual gain with all. But I will never fail to defend America's interests. One of the greatest security threats facing peace-loving nations today is the repressive regime in Iran. The regime's record of death and destruction is well known to us all. Not only is Iran the world's #1 state sponsor of terrorism, but Iran's leaders are fueling the tragic wars in both Syria and Yemen. At the same time, the regime is squandering the nation's wealth and future in a fanatical quest for nuclear weapons and the means to deliver them. We must never allow this to happen. to stop Iran's path to nuclear weapons and missiles, I withdrew the United States from the terrible Iran nuclear deal, which has very little time remaining, did not allow inspection of important sites, and did not cover ballistic missiles. Following our withdrawal, we have implemented severe economic sanctions on the country. Hoping to free itself from sanctions, the regime has escalated its violent and unprovoked aggression. In response to Iran's recent attack on Saudi Arabian oil facilities, we just imposed the highest level of sanctions on Iran's central bank and sovereign wealth fund. All nations have a duty to act. No responsible government should subsidize Iran's bloodlust. As long as Iran's menacing behavior continues, sanctions will not be lifted. They will be tightened. Iran's leaders will have turned a proud nation into just another cautionary tale of what happens when a ruling class abandons its people and embarks on a crusade for personal power and riches. For 40 years, the world has listened to Iran's rulers as they lash out at everyone else for the problems they alone have created. They conduct ritual chants of death to America and traffic in monstrous anti-Semitism. Last year, the country's supreme leader stated Israel is a malignant, cancerous tumor that has to be removed and eradicated. It is possible, and it will happen. America will never tolerate such anti-Semitic hate. Fanatics have long used hatred of Israel to distract from their own failures. Thankfully, there is a growing recognition in the wider Middle East that the countries of the region share common interests in battling extremism and unleashing economic opportunity. That is why it is so important to have full, normalized relations between Israel and its neighbors. Only a relationship built on common interests, mutual respect, and religious tolerance can forge a better future.
Speaking to world leaders at the UN Climate Summit was a 16-year-old Swedish activist, Greta Thunberg. She has inspired hundreds of thousands of school children to walk out of their classrooms to demand action on climate change. She delivered a powerful and emotional speech chastising world leaders for their inaction on climate change.
How dare you pretend that this can be solved with just business as usual and some technical solutions? With today's emissions levels, that remaining CO2 budget will be entirely gone within less than 8.5 years. There will not be any solutions or plans presented in line with these figures here today, because these numbers are too uncomfortable, and you are still not mature enough to tell it like it is. You are failing us, but the young people are starting to understand your betrayal. The eyes of all future generations are upon you. And if you choose to fail us, I say we will never forgive you.
When a U.S. president speaks at the UN, world leaders listen as to how that speech could impact their respective countries and the world overall. Joining us with a reaction from some of the world leaders at this year's UNGA is VOA United Nations correspondent Margaret Bashir. Nice to see you, Margaret. And tell me, President Trump spoke about Iran and about the fact that the United States, he pulled the United States out of the deal, but there's still some nations that are in this deal, this nuclear deal with Iran. What's sort of the talk among like France, Germany, England about this?
Right. So everyone's still in the deal except for the United States. And that would be the other permanent members of the Security Council, so Britain, France, China, and Russia, plus Germany, plus Iran. And the ministers from those countries actually had a meeting this morning here at the United Nations. Federica Mogherini, the European Union foreign policy chief, spoke to reporters afterwards. She said that they urged Iran to come back into compliance on the nuclear deal. And she said she still holds out hope that the deal can be saved. And, you know, they're doing what they can. She said that it's in the security interest of the whole world that the deal continues, and it's in Iran's economic interest, because, as you know, President Trump reinstated U.S. sanctions against Iran, and they're very tight sanctions, and he's intensified them in stages, and it's really choking Iran financially. So they do need to come back into compliance if they want to have some financial relief.
We have a minute left. President Trump also addressed the issue of religious freedom. In fact, he spoke about it on Monday at the UN. What was the impact of that?
Well, this is an initiative that also the UN is pursuing. The Secretary General announced in September, a couple of weeks ago, that he is pursuing a very similar initiative. He's been calling for hate speech around the world to be tapped out. So these sort of go hand in hand together, these initiatives to protect people of all religious faiths and in their houses of worship. And the United States pledged $25 million towards this initiative that President Trump announced on Monday here at the UN.
And, you know, and the other sort of, as we also look at, you have any sort of thought about this impeachment inquiry that the United States, that the Democrats may pursue, at least it looks like they're going to pursue it. Did that have any impact on any of the other nations as they were attending this?
I haven't heard any reaction from that. I think more the reaction is other countries are just happy they're not Ukraine. Nobody wants to be caught in the middle of this domestic scandal that's rocking the United States. No country that depends on the United States for humanitarian or military aid wants to be caught in the middle of this. And I think other countries, from what I hear, they feel for Ukraine because it's a very difficult position to be in because they depend on the United States to protect them from Russia.
Margaret, thank you. Margaret Bashir, our VOA
Thanks,
UN
Greta.
correspondent. President Trump's characterization of Iran's bloodlust dovetails neatly a statement from U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo regarding the attacks on 2 oil facilities in Saudi Arabia. Iran has denied responsibility, but the United States and other nations believe Iran was behind the drone attacks that cut Saudi oil production in half. Plugged In's Mil Arcega has more.
The September 14th drone attacks against 2 Saudi Aramco oil facilities damaged the world's biggest crude processing plant, triggering a large spike in crude oil prices. Yemen's Iranian-backed Houthi rebels have claimed responsibility. Saudi investigators say the weapons used in the attack appear to be Iranian-made. The attacks cut Saudi Arabia's daily oil production by nearly half. U.S. intelligence agencies have determined the attacks were likely launched from Iran. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo placed the blame squarely on Iran, calling it an act of war. U.S. President Donald Trump backed Saudi Arabia's position, tweeting the United States is ready to respond if needed. U.S. allies, including Great Britain, have condemned the attack, but some European countries have yet to attribute responsibility. Meantime, the U.S. approved the deployment of additional military forces to Saudi Arabia. U.S. Defense Secretary Mark Esper says they are defensive in nature, focusing primarily on air and missile defense. The United States has also accelerated shipment of military hardware to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, setting the stage for what some analysts say is a significant escalation of violence in the region. Mil Arcega, VOA News, Washington.
The back and forth between the United States and Iran is anything but new. Our next guest tells us that is all the more reason to tread with caution. Larry Brennan teaches law at Fordham University. He's a former Navy officer and was a lawyer at the U.S. Department of Justice. He remains involved in the drafting and implementation of the military rules of engagement. Nice to see you.
Good morning. Thank you, Greta.
How dangerous a situation are the United States and Iran in? Is this saber-rattling or is this more?
It's saber-rattling plus. It's been 130 consecutive days of conflict at the end of 40 years of tension between the United States and Iran. We've had physical and military conflict in the past over that time, and it has a potential of getting out of control if some small accident happens or someone continues to take aggressive action. Iran has been the provocateur on a number of occasions and has caused hundreds of billions of dollars worth of physical damage to ships and the refinery, plus loss of use.
Well, you see that complicating all of this is that Iran and Saudi Arabia was obviously the oil fields, the oil installations were attacked a couple weeks ago there, but they're also fighting this proxy war in Yemen. It's Iran and Saudi Arabia are fighting in Yemen, and the poor Yemenis are in the midst of a civil war.
Yeah, the entire Middle East region is in turmoil, and Iran has announced that it has a plan to reunite all the Arab sects and build an access to the Mediterranean by train, by pipeline, and otherwise. So the concept of being limited to the Persian Gulf and to the Straits of Hormuz is something that is no longer in the ideals in Tehran.
Prime Minister Netanyahu was not here at the UN this week because of sort of the shifting sands, the uncertainty over in that nation, in Israel, very small nation in the midst of this. What's the impact, or how does Israel fit into this whole complicated picture?
Israel is both an important ally, a colleague of the United States, and a problem in putting together a coalition. Certain nations, particularly the Arab nations, are reluctant to be publicly involved with Israel. We went through this issue twice in 1990 in the invasion of Iraq and again in the post-2001 Gulf War.
Right. Well, so many nations, including the United States, UK, and Germany, say that Iran was responsible for the attack at Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia and the United States have been working together for decades. You've got Saudi Arabia being responsible for the vicious murder of an American journalist in Turkey. How does the United States continue to, what does the United States do about Saudi Arabia?
It's a complicated answer because on one level, we've always required friends and allies in the Middle East. And at one time, Iran was our friend and ally until the fall of the Shah. Saudi has assumed that role. When we don't like the behavior of a nation, either for domestic reasons or, in this case, the murder of a journalist, it's a complicated thing that requires more than the State Department or the Department of Defense to act with. We need to work with them, and they need to work with us.
What do you predict is going to happen after this attack in Saudi Arabia? Apparently no one was killed, which seems to almost be a bright line mark for the president, because he has shown restraint previously in shooting down an American drone because there were no Americans killed, or no one's killed.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. The absence of death in the last 140 days is a miraculous factor. If someone were killed or a group of people were killed or captured, it would leave little choice. The president has a dilemma. If he doesn't act, it's going to be viewed as weakness, and that's going to be a problem for him internationally and in the re-election campaign. And if he reacts and overreacts, he's going to cause a quagmire. There are some people who drag this problem we have now back 40 years to the hostage crisis in the Carter administration. What does President Trump do? He needs to do more than wait for the Iranians to act and respond.
If you were advising him, I mean, look, there is no perfect solution. We'll know with 20/20 hindsight probably long after, maybe even 20 decades from now. But what would you recommend the president do or not do?
I'd recommend a number of things. I'd recommend not having a ground war. That would be a disaster for decades. Even if we won, we've not succeeded in making peace afterwards, as we've proven in Iraq. So that would be on the bottom of my list. I think we can take nuclear weapons off the table at this stage, unless someone else uses special weapons, which I think is highly unlikely. So we respond to the Iranian attacks in force, and we do what we did in the tanker war in the late 1980s. We destroy the economic means, because if you look at the bottom of the line of Iran, all of their conflicts, even going back to 1979-81 with the hostages, it always resolved itself around economic issues.
Right. And the president has upped the sanctions on, so there is more economic pressure. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
That's all the time we have for today. Stay plugged in by liking us on Facebook at Voice America. You can also like my Facebook page at facebook.com/Greta. And do follow me on Twitter at Greta. Thank you for being plugged in.